Hello, this is Steven Out, and yes, we're back with the top 5 underrated comic book movies. Now, basically, for this list, this is a part 2 with the Overlooked. This is the second part, and it's mostly films that are underrated. Again, I always told you Overlooked and underrated is the same, kind of run in the same category, in the same vein. So for this specific list, I'm doing films that are really not that well liked. But for me, I found films to be very underrated and do provide some good qualities. They're not perfect films by any means, but at the same time, they aren't that bad either. So hopefully to change minds or start a conversation with how you feel about these films. And I also want you to point out these are my personal opinions. If you disagree, please write in the list of what you would consider an underrated comic book film. And that essentially it. So let's try and keep it civil, please. Okay, so without any further ado, let's get into the top 5. Kicking off at number 5 is The Green Hornet. I'm not going to spend too much time because I do plan to actually review the film because it's part of my Green Hornet review series, because it's in conjecture with the Green Hornet show. The Green Hornet is basically a superhero who pretends to be a villain. By day, he is Britt Reed, owner of a newspaper publishing, a newspaper. But by night, he is the Green Hornet, a supposedly notorious criminal taking on the city's biggest criminals and racketeers. Driving around in the Black Beauty, which is driven by his sidekick and partner Kato, they go around the city essentially dispersing their own brand of justice. Now, the Green Hornet is definitely a different superhero film. It is more of a Seth Rogen film. Now, I am not the biggest fan of Seth Rogen, but I never hated this film, probably because I found it a fun, enjoyable flick, and it's also was really one of my biggest introductions to the Green Hornet, then Guy Williams and Kato's appearance on the classic Adam West Batman show. This film gets a lot of flack because it's too comedic and not serious enough. Also, Seth Rogen is not a good Green Hornet to many people. I said, yeah, but I think not a traditional Green Hornet. First off, they do it differently. They establish that he is an idiot and more of a playboy. And I do like they do a different transition of, there's not a good relationship with the father and son angle. I like how it is different, and it's definitely going against really expectations of what you would normally expect in a superhero film. The villain here, he is a traditional gangster named Chudnovsky, but with the Green Hornet's presence, and essentially him being out of touch, him being old, and even hinting he's suffering a midlife crisis, he rechristens himself as Bludnovsky, and essentially becomes more theatrical courtesy of the hero. This was one of the first aspects of the hero bringing more harm to the city than the villain. In fact, he influenced the villain to become more theatrical, flamboyant, and out there. So I kind of find it interesting. Kato here, he's no Bruce Lee, but that's a good thing, because only Bruce Lee can be Bruce Lee. The Kato here is definitely different. He's more fleshed out. He's not just a great fighter, he's a great inventor. And I do like the angle that they go with them, both fighting for, the secretary, Casey. Honestly, I think the most wasted character is Casey here, portrayed by Cameron Diaz, who is honestly not a bad choice for an act to play, but I just wish that the character was given something more to do than what we were given. Overall, I can really say the last 2 films on this list I can see people having problems with, maybe even 3 films on this list, but so far I've never had a problem with The Green Hornet. I found it just a fun flick, and a traditional Seth Rogen entertainment film. Anyway, number 4, and please don't give me flack for 4, but number 4 is... Okay, I'm definitely going to get some flack, but number 4 goes to The Lone Ranger. The Lone Ranger is a character that is actually related to the Green Hornet. In fact, the Lone Ranger is part of the Green Hornet ancestry. The Lone Ranger was first, and the Green Hornet came, really second down the line. The basic story of the Lone Ranger is he was once a Texas Ranger. After one day being ambushed by a bunch of outlaws, he is the survivor of a massacre. He is saved by an Indian named Tonto, who nurses him back to health, and he loads himself with silver bullets, makes a mask out of a vest from one of his dead colleagues, and he rides the range on a white horse named Silver and christens himself as the Lone Ranger, fighting the outlaws on the old frontier. I love how it's a different playing field. We're going in a different direction. I've always loved this film, even when critics hated it. I don't know, this is just... Honestly, Western doesn't look like this, or even has this aesthetic. I love also how the Lone Ranger is characterized. A person who believes in the law and is more of a lawyer than a gunslinger, but, he's come back to his hometown, and he kind of has to get back in the swing of things. They do this sort of prophecy thing, which I don't mind, because it's more ambiguous. You don't know if it's really from the dead, or it's really just his mind, courtesy of being gunned down. Honestly, the villains here, Butch Cavendish is, for me, a very memorable henchman, even though his brother being the big boss is kind of mediocre and generic. Of course, this film has the biggest flack is, of course, for Tonto, portrayed by Johnny Depp. People don't like it because they felt that a Native American should be playing Tonto, not Johnny Depp. I never had a problem with that. Because, for me, if you could have Brits play Americans, I have no problems with a American actor playing Tonto. A normal American playing a Native American. As long as you understand it's a different, more, different character that doesn't come off as too, racist. And I don't think it does for the most part. Again, I might be wrong because I'm clearly not Native American. So I don't know what is offensive and what isn't. But for me, I just saw it as just an eccentric Johnny Depp character, not a Native American character. And I'm kind of on board with that. However, if I could really give this film flack, because I got no problem with the story, it feels like the classic Lone Ranger show. But for me, my biggest flack would be, it's called The Lone Ranger. The Lone Ranger should be the main central character and be the main focus. But they really try to push Johnny Depp's Tonto to be more so. Hell, even in the posters, you get, either Johnny Depp get more, the appeal than the Lone Ranger, which is a very shame for me. Because the Lone Ranger, for me, is such a great character here, and how they've done him. At least for me, he is. But the actor plays him, is an odd choice. Hell, odd choice, but, it's, but then again, he's supposed to be a person that's more of a lawyer, and so he evolves into, a gunslinger. So I kind of like that. Overall, I could see why people hate this film, but I never once had a problem with it. Hell, half of my family doesn't even have a problem with this film. Again, may just be me. Anyway, number 3. Number 3 goes to Batman Forever, released in 1995. After Batman Returns, which was directed by Tim Burton, the controversy really of being too dark for kids. He was kind of, I wouldn't say forced, but he saw the writing on the wall and decided to leave the project, and brought in Joel Schumacher, who honestly is a great director. He's done great dark films, but he was definitely obligated by the studio's execs to make a more lighthearted and funny and lighthearted film. So he had to kind of balance Tim Burton's dark tone, which critics liked, with what the studio wanted, with a more lighthearted take. And I feel for the most part, Batman Forever gets it right. Joel Schumacher's films are very much mixed in with the Batman fans. Most of them hated, especially Batman and Robin, but Batman Forever does have its few fans, and I am one of them. First off, I love this film because it's one of my earliest Batman films to have ever watched. This film introduced me to Robin's origin. This film was the introduction to Two-Face, which for a while was my favorite Batman villain. Before that, it was actually Riddler. And of course, my introduction to Jim Carrey as the Riddler in general. Now, I love this film as it does have a lot of throwbacks and homages to the 60s show, but it's still trying to be dark and dark in a way. This film has a definitely different aesthetic style, and I liked how Joel Schumacher was allowed to do what he wanted, and did have some creative freedom here. It's the second one where I think he had too much obligation to do what the studio execs wanted. Also, this film also has a bit of exploring Batman's psyche, the first time a film ever did that, and the ramifications and the trauma of his childhood. Val Kilmer gives a very underrated performance as Batman, and in fact he's kind of not talked about as much, which is ironic because George Clooney is considered the worst and he's more talked about than Val Kilmer. You can definitely tell Val Kilmer is trying to bring on a bit of what his predecessor had, but he's also wanted to explore a bit more of Batman's psyche. And again, I think he does that tremendously well. I really wish he could have really continued, to explore more of his psyche and further develop the character's evolution. In fact, what I love about Batman Forever now is they try to have Batman more so evolve and move past his trauma. Something that honestly rarely happens in most Batman media, because at some point he has to get over his trauma. I absolutely loved Robin here. He has these young punk, something you'd expect from the 90s. I think it became too much of a whine in the sequel. So far, he's done really good. The villains here are cartoony, silly, and fun, especially Jim Carrey's Riddler. You can tell he's definitely playing homage to Frank Gorshin's time in the role back in the 60s show. Tommy Lee Jones' Two-Face is definitely a Joker clone, but I feel this is what Two-Face would have been if he was in the 60s TV show. Overall, for me, this film is just a fun blast. It's not the train wreck as Batman and Robin, and for me, it's also at the same time not groundbreaking compared to the first two. But for me, it has so many hidden gems. Give Batman Forever to watch. Number 2. Number 2 goes to Dick Tracy, released in 1990. After the success of Tim Burton's first Batman film, many studios execs jumped on the bandwagon to create their new superhero film. The problem is, during the 90s, they were adapting from Pulp Fictions or, older superheroes that really the younger audience would not know, and I think the mainstream by that point forgotten about. Surprisingly, Dick Tracy was very successful. Dick Tracy was directed, produced, and stars Warren Beatty in the role of Dick Tracy. Dick Tracy was Warren Beatty's childhood character growing up, so I think he wanted to really bring authenticity. The film basically revolves around really Dick Tracy battling his, rogues gallery of gangsters. What I love about the film is the aesthetics. It feels like a comic book or comic strips from the era, the 30s and the 40s, just coming to life. It's so bright, it's colorful. No other superhero film looks like this, and I like how it can get absurd and over the top. I love the aesthetics here and the great performances. Warren Beatty does a terrific Dick Tracy as this tough guy detective who is just as smart but also at the same time struggling, just find this sort of family life that he's slowly developing throughout the film. The villain, Big Boy Caprice, is a retweak of the Big Boy character from the comic strips, and he's portrayed, of course, by the always talented Al Pacino, who does basically Al Pacino, this over-the-top yelling, all of that. It's just great. And the gangsters, they have such unique and distinctive facial features that, honestly, you can't mistake them for one another. There's even cameos to just the small Dick Tracy characters here with the gangsters. Again, the aesthetic here always blew me away, and I just love it. However, this film does have a weak story and albeit mediocre fights, but I just love the environment, the world that is created in this flick. In my opinion, if they just tweaked the story and gave really groundbreaking action sequences, this could have been a masterpiece. But as it stands, it's because of these faults that really doesn't make it higher. And honestly, the reason why this film is at number 2 is because of the aesthetic, and honestly, just because, I remember this, just watching it, and even when it's on, I will stop to watch. It is that great. And this was done by Disney. Warren Beatty still owns the rights to Dick Tracy, and you hear rumors that they're going to either do a reboot or a TV show. Either way, I would gladly jump on board to see. Honestly, for me, Dick Tracy is a character that is a period piece character and can only work in the 30s or 40s. It can't work in modern day. At least how I view it. If they can try, and who knows, they might make it work, but for me, it just seems very unlikely. Overall, this film is just definitely groundbreaking in aesthetics. Give it a watch. In fact, it won an Oscar for its visual style. Give it a watch. You will enjoy it. But there must be a number 1. So at number 1 goes to Punisher Warzone, released in 2008. Honestly, for me, this film, before the Netflix show did, for me, screams Punisher. In the film, basically, the Punisher is taking on the local mafia, and essentially is going up against Billy Rizzuti, aka Billy the Beaut, better known as Jigsaw as he later becomes in the film, and he partially is responsible for creating him. But whilst he's doing that, having to, take down the local mob, I do like how they flesh out the Punisher character, as he accidentally kills one of the good guys, and he's suffering from ramifications. He killed a person doing his job, and he's more than that, he's left these kids, the wife and the father, the wife and father, essentially, the wife and, kids, essentially just leaving them with nothing. they lost the father. And I do like it proves to his psyche, because the Punisher was once a family man. He had a normal life, but it was taken from it in such a brutal and unfair way. This film definitely gets a lot of flack for being too violent. First off, that's the freaking point. The Punisher is a violent superhero. He's an anti-hero. He's clearly had demons. He's meant to be this very much messed up character who, is trying to get justice, but also doing it in an event that is just way too violent and just something that just can't be explained. I also love the fact that, first off, the man playing the Punisher here, Ray Stevenson, for me, it just screams the character. His clothing screams what the character should look like. I just wish maybe the skull could be more embedded, but that's it. He looks like a guy that I buy was a military man, but also buy that he was, at one point, a good father. In fact, a great father. Also, the character of Jigsaw here, played by Dominic West, that's Jigsaw, a disturbed gangster, a traditional mafia guy, disturbed gangster with a messed up face. And again, just like in the comics, the Punisher was responsible for his creation. For me, I don't get why is this film so hated. Maybe the story is lacking, but also the story is providing something new. Providing more of a psychic in-depth to the character, but also fleshing him out, showing his human side. I also like how they don't disturb the violence. It's over-the-top silly, but comic book films are meant to be fantasies. You're not really... if you want something to be set in reality, do something set in reality. This is different in everything. So I don't get why this film is so hated. But then again, that's just me. If you have problems with this film or any others on this list, that's fine. That's up to you. But I've never had a problem with any of these films, and I enjoy them. Do they have faults? Of course they do. No film is perfect. But then again, that's why I like it when you have films that have faults. For me, that's a great discussion, and you can explain it, and and as a result of that, laugh at the silliness or the absurdity of it. That's what I love when films aren't always perfect. But then again, films need to find a right balance of something still enjoyable to watch, and you can still have stuff that are silly or faults that don't ruin the whole thing. Again, these films are so underrated in my mind because they're not that bad in my eyes. They're fun entertainment. And for me, this is a comic book film that really is pushing the boundaries of being dark, but also exploring the character here. For me, this is, before the Netflix series, this is, honestly, the clear-cut image of the Punisher for me. And honestly, Ray Stevens does a fantastic job, and it's very sad that he's very underrated. So that's why Punisher Warzone is the most underrated comic book film, in my opinion, of all time. There we have it. Those were my top 10 underrated comic book movies. Do you have others that you want to do? Top 5 underrated comic book films. Do you have others on this list? Which ones would you put on the list? What are yours? Please write them down in the comments. I really want to hear from you guys. And this is it. This was the second part, and we are done with the whole overlooked and underrated. I do plan to do the Sopranos TV show series next. I actually have plans on how I want to do it because it is it's a very intimidating show to review. And I do plan to have that hopefully some point either on the weekend or some point next week. But until then, this has been the Steven Hour. Ladies and gentlemen, so long for now, and enjoy the rest of your day.